All right, let's see what we got here. Ooh, Nuka-Cola, very good. All right, what else do we have over here? Oh, adhesives, yes, fantastic, jackpot. It's got to be something else over here though. Aluminum, oh, you know I need that aluminum. What else do we have here? Oh my goodness, I can't even believe it. It's a Mr. Handy robot. Ah, over encumbered. Greetings, fellow makers. Welcome down to the shop. I'm Bill Duran, and today I'm going to show you how I made this little Mr. Handy scale model. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I've been playing a lot of Fallout 4 lately, and when I found the little model-sized Mr. Handy out in the wasteland, I was absolutely tickled and I had to have one for myself, so I set about making one. Now, this guy here is actually a scaled-down version of the full-size Mr. Handy, which is slightly different than the little model version that you find in the game, but I liked this one better. To get started, I loaded up Fallout 4 on my PlayStation 4, and I took a whole bunch of screenshots and video to use as a reference for this guy for doing my 3D modeling. I decided to use this as an excuse to learn the basics of Fusion 360. And I also want to thank Colin over at Autodesk for giving me a crash course in the software. It's really great. If you're a hobbyist or a student or a startup company like me, then you can grab a copy for free. You have no excuse not to. It's really awesome, and they have a bunch of video tutorials to get you started. All of my Mr. Handy parts were modeled in Fusion 360 separately so that I could 3D print them and so that I could make molds of them. This was a pretty painstaking process with lots of little detail bits, and I left some of the parts out because I knew they wouldn't 3D print very well. For example, the nameplate on the back has some really tiny text, and instead of trying to print those, I actually carved them into the printed piece using my laser cutter. I wasn't sure how this would work, so I did a test really fast on a scrap printed piece, and it worked great. So I put the back plate into the laser and etched in the Mr. Handy text. I also used the laser to cut out the iris part of the eyeball. This was done with some styrene plastic. That part, once it was cut out, could then be glued into the 3D printed piece. The rest of the parts were just printed out on my Dremel 3D printer in a PLA plastic, and I was actually really impressed with the quality that it spit out. Of course, I still had to do a lot of cleanup work. All of these parts needed to be cleaned up to get rid of that 3D printed look. I've been doing this for a few months now, and I've come up with a pretty good process. What I like to do is to first sand everything down with a 220 grit sandpaper. If I can get rid of as much of that 3D print texture as possible on this step, then I do so. Then everything gets hit with a filler primer. This will fill in any of the gaps that are remaining, and then I can go back in with more sandpaper, usually a higher grit, maybe a 400, and sand the surface down almost all the way to the plastic again, so that I can see any of the areas that might need a little bit of love. Once that's all set, I hit everything again with a little more just normal primer, and then it all got wet sanded down to the surface finish that I wanted for mold making. You could, of course, just paint it at this point, but I wanted to make some molds so that I could make a couple of copies and so that I wouldn't have to print 3 eyes and 3 legs. Now, most of these parts were molded using a 2-part molding process where I would clay up half of the mold, pour a bunch of silicone on top of it, and then when that cured, I could flip it over, remove the clay, and pour in the other half of the silicone. This does take a while, but it makes some really, really nice molds. If you'd like to get a crash course on some more mold making, we've got a whole video series. We'll have a link to that down in the description. Now, the lenses that go in the eyeballs were a little bit different. I sanded down the 3D printed pieces, but then I brushed on an epoxy on top of the lens so that when it cured, I'd have a nice smooth surface. These were molded just like the rest of the parts, but when I cast them, I used Smooth Cast 325, which cures pretty clear, and I put them in a pressure pot. This would ensure that any bubbles that are remaining would be compressed down to a microscopic size. Once it was all cured, I could pop out the lenses and they looked nice and see-through and shiny and just the way lenses should look. The rest of the robot parts were cast with Smooth Cast 300. This is a urethane resin. I put a little bit of tint in there to make them gray. Once they popped out of the molds, they needed a tiny bit of cleanup because it was a two-part mold. There's a seam that needs to get sanded down. I also had to cut off some of the sprues from the pouring process and drill some holes for the assembly. This is so that the little arms could get all those adorable little accessory pieces like the flamethrower. Then I glued all of these little pieces to some stands for the painting process. I started by base coating everything with a black spray paint. This is a Krylon Fusion that's meant for plastic. Then I went over everything using a crappy airbrush with low air pressure on purpose to sort of sputter a bunch of silver paint all over the surface, not getting total coverage. I did the same thing again with a darker paint. This was a gunmetal, and that left a really cool textured metallic surface on all of the robot parts. A bunch of the other details were done by hand. For example, the pupil was black, so I just used some black acrylic paint in there. The iris was more of a silver, so I went over that. Some of the trim parts were also done using a darker metallic paint. The flamethrower got some yellow and some red. And then a bunch of the body panels were covered with a lighter silver paint. I let all of this dry overnight to make sure it was all set before I did my weathering, and the weathering was the really fun part. I started with a wash of a dirty green. I wanted it to look like it was kind of mildewy, like he's been sitting around for a couple hundred years. I covered everything in this green watered down acrylic paint, and then I blotted off a bunch of it using a paper towel. Then I went back over it using a sponge, removing even more in sort of a haphazard pattern. If I found there was still too much paint, I'd wet it down a little bit and then use that sponge to take even more of it off, scrape a little bit off of it until I was satisfied with the finish. Once that layer was dry, I went back over it again, this time with more of a rusty wash. And I was a little more selective this time, using a sponge again to apply the paint in just a couple areas that I wanted, and then again blotting it a bit with paper towels and sponges until I was happy with the finish. Once the surface was all grimy, I needed to make sure that the crevices looked all greasy and dirty because this guy's been sitting around in the wasteland for a long time. So I reached for my favorite oil paints. These are water mixable oil paints, and I used a black and a brown and then just started smearing it in all of the crevices using a brush. These are great. They're kind of greasy like you would find on a robot. Once I got it on all the crevices, I could just use a paper towel to wipe most of it away until everything looked sufficiently dirty. I also went back in with more of these paints to add some streaks to make it look like some of the spots have been leaking some fluids. Once that was done, I could take those nice lenses that I made and pop them in their sockets. Once they are in there, I could go around the edges a little bit and weather them. Finally, I got my airbrush with some flat black acrylic paint and added a little bit of char to the exhaust port on his jet. With the painting all done, I could assemble our little fella. This went by really, really fast. All I had to do was super glue all of the parts together. This was extremely satisfying, really fun to see him come together right at the end. Ta-da! My tiny little Mr. Handy was all finished, ready to go, ready to find his way through the wasteland. This was an extremely satisfying build. I don't know what it is about tiny robots, but I am in love with making little pieces, little robots, and this guy was a perfect project to test out some of those skills. Thank you guys so much for watching this build video. This was a lot of fun. I love this guy. I made him printed him a little top hat. That's gonna be really adorable. I'll have to finish that up for him. We have a couple more other Fallout videos ready for your hungry eyeballs right there if you want to dive into those. We also have the mold making video series. We also have a 3D printing video series, all linked down below and definitely worth checking out. You guys are awesome for checking out the video and for supporting us, especially our patrons over on patreon.com/punishedprops. Head on over there if you want to help us make these videos. Toss a little coin our way, make this a bit more of a two-way street. And before you ask, no, I won't be selling any kits of this guy. Sorry to say, but you should totally try and make one yourself. Also, I will be hanging on to the 3D files. If you want one, you gotta go model it yourself. Fortunately, we have a bunch of videos for you, some tutorials to help you down that path. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you guys all next week. Man, this is gonna look so sweet next to my bobbleheads. In a couple days.